Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jessica, and first of all, thank you very much for inviting me over here at SOSD. It was already interesting to see great talks now, and I'm already excited for the other ones. And yeah, introducing my topic now, I just want to quickly give an overview what this talk is about. We will talk about animations today. We will talk about where animations actually come from, which kind of history backs up animations, and we will also see how we can nowadays actually leverage tools and APIs to bring animations to the web. And last but not least, we will actually have a look at a more specific example on how we can leverage these tools in a JavaScript application framework like Ember to create our own single-page applications that make use of modern technology to bring animations to the web. But before we get into the topic, just shortly a quick introduction of myself. I'm currently working as a software engineer, as Margarita already said, at Simplabs, which is a German Munich-based software company specialized in consulting in Rails, Ember.js, and also like Phoenix and Elixir. So if you're interested about that, feel free to speak to me after the talk. After work, I actually really enjoy to dive into the world of my hometown Berlin, where I currently live. Here in the background, you can see the Alexander Tower that you can almost see from anywhere across the city because it's that high. And it's really cool. I really enjoy to check out the vegetarian cuisine here in the city. So I'm a real foodie. I'm also really interested in art and like to draw myself in my spare time. Also, I'm one of the co-organizers and mentors of different workshops under the umbrella of Open Text School. Open Text School is an organization that is internationally represented in different chapters, so-called kind of like working groups for different cities. For example, we have a chapter in Berlin, and what we tried is to provide free access to learning resources about technology. So we try to encourage people to do their own user groups, to host their own workshops, and also give like talk-driven events like this one. So this is actually pretty cool to see. And also last but not least, I started together with two other Ember developers from the Berlin community to actually organize the Ember.js Berlin Meetup. We just started in the beginning of this year to actually take over the organization of that. And this is quite exciting to see the rather familiar community of this framework in the city. And if you are into Ember and you ever want to pop by in Berlin, also give us a shout out and maybe just show off at our meetup. Or if you want to give a talk, you're also very welcome. We would love to have you as a speaker there as well. So this is already the commercial break. And now let's get actually into the topic, right? So this talk is about animations, and why this kind of like interested is really close to me is because I can remember when I was a kid, like especially Saturday mornings, like usually from like 7 a.m., you know, this is the time when kids actually get up, you know, like very early in the morning until into the afternoon. I would watch like one thing, I would watch cartoons, right? So this was actually pretty cool. I really liked how stories could actually be driven by like drawings, and they were animated, and they were like really vivid, and could have like sparked my imagination about how the world operates, and also just like very fantastic stories that have not so much correlation to the real world at all, right? So this was really cool. And yeah, later on now in my adult life, I actually realized, like thinking about it, what cartoons actually are, we realized it's a more very specific category of animations. So it's kind of like an animation that is targeted at a certain group of people, usually like children or maybe young at heart adults, right? And they are more driven to an entertainment purpose. So we try to tell stories that are entertaining to just spend a great time watching cartoons. And interestingly, we as web developers, we also oftentimes work with animations and think about animations, right? And if we think about animations, usually different things like these that I just want to briefly mention come to our mind. We might think about animations related to UI elements, right? So we would think about, oh yeah, last week I had to implement this new hover state animation on our call to action buttons on our website, right? Or we might think about something like page transitions. So how can I actually create smooth transitions in our app to make it like more feasible for the users to understand that a transition is happening and where they're going? And for example, in the Ember community, a very popular add-on for creating page transition-driven animations and also in-page animations is the add-on Ember Liquidfire. So just to briefly explain, in the kind of like Ember ecosystem, the use of add-ons, like kind of like community-driven add-ons is like very popular. So people, if they want to see something in the framework that's not implemented yet, will just create an add-on that you can easily install into any kind of Ember application, just like use out of the box, which is kind of like nice. So open source-driven enhancement of the framework itself. And also last but not least, we might think about something like data visualization focus, like SVG animations, how we can, for example, work with D3.js to create like useful visualizations of data to the user so they don't have to go through like tables to actually find out more about like number values, right? So especially like this part of the topic animations, like data visualizations, I have the feeling is very well explored in the community and I think also very important. And if we think about all these things that I just mentioned, we realize that all of these topics kind of like can be summarized under category term like informative UX. This is like a term I picked up from a very great talk by Sarah Dresner, who's a very notable developer in the web animations community. And in her talk at JSConf Asia, she actually talks about how informative UX helps us to guide the user through processes on our website. So if you, for example, have an e-commerce website, we know at the end of this full funnel of different page transitions, we actually want the customer, the user, to buy something, to click on a button, pay, and actually do the transaction. We want to optimize our conversion for that. And one way to actually do this is to enhance the information we give to the user and also like guide them through the process. And one way to achieve this is actually using actively animations, right? For example, using sensible page transitions to know to give the user information, oh, I actually did a page transition and I can just like go back in the other way around. And we might use interactions or animations on important elements like progress buttons to inform the user. This is like the important bit that you have always to pay attention to on every page of our checkout process, right? And all of these things are also, in my opinion, very important. And you should totally check out a very notable person in this area, for example, Sarah Dresner, to learn more about that. But interestingly, all of this I won't talk about today. What I actually want to talk to you about is another, I think, pretty big area of animations that has been already widely been explored in traditional media, but not so far yet on the web. And this is actually the purpose of animations to be the product itself, what we want to deliver to the audience, to our users, to actually create real stories out of animations and create them and also like tell them to our users through the means of, for example, cartoons on the web. And with this said, let's just maybe have a quick look on what animations actually are, how they're composed of, and what the history of that looks like. Probably the first notable example of animations as we know them today in the context of frame-by-frame animations. We will get to this also later, what this actually means, like frame-by-frame, is the horse in motion by the photographer Muybridge, Edward Muybridge. And in the end of the 19th century, he actually created a series of like still images of a rider running across a track and arranging them in this piece of these 12 images. And it's actually quite fascinating. Like, back in the 19th century, you didn't have like so much technology to actually achieve that, right? So you had to be a little bit like smart about the setup. And what he would actually do, he would like spread across like the Palo Alto track, right? Like a series of like cameras. And he would have a setup where the horse actually running past the cameras could like kind of like pull strings that would then be linked to the shutter of the individual cameras to actually create the series, right? And because it was 19th century, this was actually not so easy, right? So it took like years to finish this piece. But he finally did it. And this is like the most notable example of like animations as we know it today, because back then what, kind of like not many people have done then was actually taking photographs and putting them into a certain device. We will see later also how this actually looks like, that would allow you to see the photographs in a rapid succession, right? And Muybridge also did this with his photographs. And what we see then is like suddenly not only like a series of images, we actually have this imagination that, oh, this horse is actually running across the track again, right? So this looks like quite amazing. And this was like very a very big breakpoint for this time regarding the idea of animations in this regard. Also, if you look at the early beginnings at the very similar time in the end of 19th century, we also see different devices to be spun up to create these kind of like more like thumb cinema kind of like animations. So for example, here we see like a round device that users could actually look like through the slits. So like kind of like your view field is like restricted. And then if you look on the other side through the slit on this kind of like background, you would see like these images kind of like just flying by in a rapid succession, and this would create this illusion of, oh, this couple is actually dancing, right? So this kind of like devices were quite of like common. And also very shortly after that, so here, for example, you can see in 1888, so like just 10 years after Murbridge's Horse in Motion, we already have the first kind of like scenery movies, right? So if you look at that, for example, it's quite fascinating. Like this is the very first movie, by the way. So this is like the oldest piece of film that we know of nowadays. And it's like the whole movie already. It's like a 2-second clip, actually, if you play it like at this rate. And it just shows like the family of Louis the Prince, who's like the creator of this, walking through the garden, right? But this was already a great breakpoint that you could take a camera, you would get like a series of images on a film, and then you would play it off again on a projector and create something like a scene that seems as if it was alive, which was really great. And if we see in these examples, we realize what do we actually need for an animation? What would be like a definition of an animation? And what we can deduct is like the core concepts of that we take an image sequence, we show them at a certain frequency, a display rate, and then later on we will actually get this illusion of motion. And with illusion, I actually mean that, yeah, of course, you know, it's like just a series of still images, so this has to come from somewhere that it seems as if it was animated. And this is like actually to a really great part due to the fact how our brain works in regards of visual processing. So what we have here is that already in the beginning of the 20th century, a psychologist called Max Wertheimer realized there's like this phenomenon that if like images are shown like at a short enough interval, but not too short, because if it was too short, then you would have the feeling that images are just shown at the same time, right? So it has to be a little bit bigger than that, but still a very short time frame. By the way, it's like around 30, 40 milliseconds. That at this point we have an effect he describes as a phi phenomenon. The human brain cannot distinguish these two images as distinct anymore, but on the other hand, not as distinct that you would have the feeling, oh, you just showed me two different images. But in fact, it tries to modulate the two different images shown after each other and tries to interpret it as a motion. This is kind of fascinating, right? So, and even as early as in the beginning of the 20th century, Max Wertheimer already figured out this has a lot to do with our human brains. Like even like in 2000, they still did like studies on this, what actually like the optimal interval is. And yeah, they found like that something over 30 milliseconds is already sufficient to give us this experience of, oh yeah, something moved. Like I saw these two images on the left and on the right, and yeah, the stroke actually moved to the right. This is already sufficient, but you can also go lower than that if you have like a long display of images. This is already kind of cool. And also just to shortly see this, here in this regard, maybe if you are into movies or films, you already know about the concept of frame per seconds. So like different movies can be shot in different kind of like frame rates, with a frame being an image at a certain rate, usually described in frames per second. So 24 frames per second is something around like 40 milliseconds interval between the onset of one image to the next. And this is, by the way, also a very still popular frame rate for traditional cinema. So because this kind of like grew a little bit historically, like for a long time it was like quite not so productive to actually do like film processing with like longer frame rates, because if you had higher frame rates, you had a lot of like film to actually use to get like a full scene, right? So you would kind of like go to this kind of like where you run like, okay, the animation still looks smooth, but yeah, we also don't waste too much of our film and production costs on editing and everything, right? And still nowadays, if like people, even if they have like much more technology advanced, like cameras at the hand and also like digital production, they still try to opt oftentimes to 24 frames per second because we got very accustomed to this kind of like seminar. And they realize it gives us like this cinematic feeling if you watch a movie, right? So we watch a movie and we expect it to look a little like blurry if it moves across, right? So 24 frames per second, still very popular, but also a lot of directors are currently exploring higher frame rates, like for example, 48 frames per second or 60. So I found this really quite interesting to also explore how this developed in motion picture. And if we look at cartoons again, like actually hand-drawn animations, also like in traditional media like TV or cinema, we realize a similar process is going on here. We try to create frames, so like a series of images that are drawn, and we try to show them one after each other. So we might just photograph them and then just play them off again, and with digital editing nowadays, do this all like virtually, but still in the same kind of like principle, frame by frame based animations are still at the very core of traditional cartoon cinema and movie productions. And yeah, the interesting thing is the story doesn't end here. So we realized, okay, TV, cinema, they all explored it a lot. But what about actually the medium that we are most comfortable with? The medium where we go like, oh, we actually love it. And it's actually quite modern and a little bit more advanced than like TV and cinema as we know it today. What actually about the web? Can we also see like a story going on here? And I actually think so. I think actually animations are going and moving to the web even more and more. And with this said, let's maybe have a look at what kind of like tools, APIs we can actually use to create these animations. It's quite interesting when I looked this up and I tried to find out, okay, what was the first time someone did like animations on the web? I realized I had to go back a very long time, actually like 20 years ago, right? And if you think about this, this is like an immense amount of time, but even back then, 20 years ago, there was already a tool that many people used, still used for quite a long time after that. People are still using it nowadays, I think. I mean, not everyone talks openly about it, but it's still kind of like out there, right? And it kind of like shaped how we created multimedia content, also how we delivered it multimedia content, probably for at least like 15 years or something like that. And probably some of you already have like a hunch. They see the red background, they go like, I know what's coming now. Right, we're talking about Macromedia Flash. And this was actually a really, really amazing platform, right? It not only offered us like to create this multimedia content and also like deliver it like with its own kind of like proprietary standard, but also with a very nice, kind of like, how would you call it? Like an IDE, a kind of like platform that not only developers could use, but also like designers, creators who were not familiar with programming, enabled and empowered them to create their own stories and animations out of the box. This was quite amazing. And I really had to look it up like on Wikipedia. I'm not kidding. First release, Macromedia Flash, was in the end of 1969, which is, by the way, the same year that Spice Girls had like the one-hit wonder wannabe, right? And we still had rewritable CDs, right? Such a long time ago. And was super popular, right? But yeah, people had to move on at some time point. There were some restrictions. Browsers stopped supporting Macromedia Flash, and it got a little bit more hindrance to actually like, kind of like get access to users or actually like giving them access to what you wanted to deliver with Flash. And then shortly after, like the Flash era kind of like came to this kind of like descent, we had a new standard emerging, and you also already know it. It's like HTML5, which gave us like support for videos, also like for audio, and last but not least, also for animations. And with this, we actually got access to a wide range of different open web standards. And if I'm talking about HTML5 animations, open web standards, this kind of like term can be taken very loosely, actually. We realize, for example, that HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript can all be like summarized under this kind of like home term of like open web standards, right? So this is quite amazing. And also, if we think about open web standards, we realize that they are on the one hand open, which is really great. So this actually helps us with actually building features now and also being involved in discussion on how they actually should be implemented in browsers, which is great. Also, consistency-wise, we realized that these standards evolve over quite a long time in the browsers and will be still available in the future, and therefore we can actually reach our users anytime, anywhere, on any device. But interestingly, let's have a look about the creator experience. And we realized that creator experience-wise, Flash had like a very high standard, right? So there was this graphic user interface designers could just like use. And yeah, what about HTML5? Like it's actually like some programming involved, right? Like how does this actually look like? And there's a very cool talk, you should totally check it out, by Rachel Naboris, a keynote on her kind of like transgression from a traditional media cartoonist to web animations developer. And she tells about her experience on seeing the different specs around HTML5 and CSS3 emerging, and then finally realizing, oh, this is actually quite accessible, and I can actually create all the stories that are already created in traditional media, again on the web, and actually can move to a more modern platform. So this is very inspiring. And yeah, let's just have a quick look at the demos. So let's have a look at HTML5. This is like actually a very big part of the HTML5 spec if you're into animations. And HTML5 Canvas actually offers us an out-of-the-box HTML tag that we can just plug and play into our website and have access to a very powerful API. In this API, we have access to a context object, right? So we can create a canvas element, and then we can actually grab this HTML element, and from this, we can actually deduct the context object, right? So we can get this one, and this gives us access to the kind of like part of the context. There's also like a 3D one. If you're like into WebGL, this might be interesting. But for our animations, we only use the 2D one. And interestingly, although the HTML5 Canvas API is already quite widely supported in browsers, if it shouldn't be like that, you can still check if you need like a polyfill, right? And just like install a polyfill for that. So a JavaScript library that would actually emulate the behavior that is not implemented in browsers yet, so you can write code for the future today. And let's have a look at like one of these components that we want to build, right? So we could have, for example, this very nice raccoon hero character. I draw it. I didn't went to art school, so please don't judge, right? And then you can click on it, right? And then what we want to achieve, for example, is that we have like a raccoon and he's flying like from a skyscraper, trying to save a gentleman from getting his handbag robbed, right? So it looks really cool. And let's have a look how we can actually build that. So first of all, we would have to create the component. In Ember, we can do this via handlebar templates. So components are always like a composite of a component.js file and like a template HPS file. And we could just put it like into curly brackets and put it into our template. We can provide a width and a height for our canvas element later on. And then we can actually, in our canvas file, in our component file, can declare a canvas object, which will later on be the wrapper for the component when it's rendered. And also we would have to create the sprite sheet first, right? So you draw you a nice spreadsheet, or you find someone who's artistic and get the sprite sheet from them. And then we would actually have to do a little bit of calculation to get this right, to map it to the canvas, right? Because the canvas API is actually quite low level, so we have to do a little bit like of math. But once we get this done, we find out, okay, where's the source actually of the upper left corner of our image, and what is the width and the height, and also on the same time at the canvas, we are already good to go, right? It takes a little bit of time, but you get there. And then we can actually start to draw on the canvas. And first of all, what we would have to do is like asynchronously load our image, right? Usually if we use an image tag in HTML, the page does this already for us. Now we're in JavaScript world, we try to draw an image to the canvas, so we have to do it ourselves. And we can just use an onload handler on the image, and then actually create the image, and once it gets loaded, actually set the different properties we need, for example, the height and the width for the calculation of where we want to draw it on the canvas. And then also, we actually set the image instance onto our component. We can create a draw function. These come out of the box, clear rect and draw image of the Canvas API. And then later on, we can actually set the context on our element, and actually call the draw function. But all of this does, all the setup right now, it only draws one image, no animation whatsoever, right? Already quite some work, but we're getting there. So we try to hook in the actions so we can actually run our animations. What we have to do is to actually create a loop, a function that we call again and again. In Ember, for example, we can do this with the run loop. And we can then kind of like call this function again and again. And by the way, if you're using the Canvas API, you could also use request animation frame for that. But for this example, I'm just showing this. And also, if we want to pause the animation later on, we would also have to, kind of like remember in our component which kind of instance is currently running so we can cancel it again. So we can, for example, create a loop property that we set on our component, and then later on in our action we could define something like this. So we actually say if the user, for example, with a button toggles a property, run animation, we can actually cancel this loop and actually set it to null so the animation is not running anymore, right? So this is quite great. And then if we're done, we actually finally have our raccoon flying on top of everything. So this is quite great. But we realize also, if you summarize this, that we already, performance-wise, we realize it's actually quite great to use like the HTML5 Canvas because we don't have to create DOM elements for any kind of like element that we want to animate, which is already great. We get a lot of the developer control on what we actually want to render on our view layer. Creator experience-wise, I'm not really so sure. Like if I wasn't like a lot into JavaScript, I would go like, okay, this is actually quite a lot of hassle to go through until I get one animation running. And accessibility-wise, we also might run into the issue that because we don't have any DOM objects or DOM elements kind of like rendered, it's like, harder for us with just like sensible HTML defaults and elements to create an accessible experience here. So just to summarize, this takes a lot of wiring up, right? So we realized, okay, like is there maybe something else that I can use, like out of the box mirror or something like that? So let's have a look at another API. And I actually got familiar with it just when I created this talk. So it's like actually quite cutting edge, I have the feeling. And it's called Web Animations API. And may I just briefly ask, like, who has heard of this before? Like here in the audience, like raise your hand if you have heard of Web Animations API before. Okay, a couple of hands, yeah, cool. It's actually quite straightforward in its API. We will have a look at that soon. And it also enables us actually to create animations and is still evolving in a specification. So I believe it's really the animation of the future. But if you look at the browser support, you can already see a lot of olive green, red, not such a good sign, right? So this probably means like, okay, no, we can't use it really, right? So, but luckily, again, we get a lot of love from the open source community, and there's of course polyfills for that. So the Web Animations JS polyfill and also Web Animations Next polyfill, like things that are not even implemented in evergreen browsers yet, helps us to create this Web Animations API powered cartoons today on the web. And also in Ember World, of course, we have again an add-on for that. We can just install Ember install Web Animations Next polyfill, and we get all these modern features of the API spec out of the box in our app. And I think the really important thing about like the Web Animations API is that how much it resembles CSS3 as we know it, like from our days where we wrote maybe like a lot of like CSS still do, or also like as a designer, I actually am really familiar with CSS, right? So I might create, for example, like keyframes like these to create a nice animation on a website. And now if we look actually at the Web Animations API and how keyframes are defined, we realize, oh, okay, this looks actually almost kind of like the same, right? So we can create these keyframes and still use them as, very similarly to CSS3. And just having a quick look on how this could look like in a demo. So we want to, for example, create something like this, a character moving on a pane again with the Web Animations API. So we create the component, we create our keyframe effects again, and then we will create these kind of like objects that we can pass in as configuration for our comic panel, and then we will also pass in this object animation options. So like similar to CSS3, you will always have like keyframes, and then with animations option like duration or like iteration, you will go through this animation. And then we can just pass this into our comic panel and are good to go. If you want to create and start the animation, we now only have to do like 3 things. We have to grab the keyframes, the animations options, and we can call this handy function .animate on HTML elements due to the Web Animations API, and out of the box we have an animation just up and running, just like that. Very simple. So very similar actually like to jQuery Animate, if you still remember that, right? So looks really cool actually in my opinion. And yeah, what we do here also, we hook into the Ember.js component lifecycle hook, right? So if something did render in our component, then actually we trigger that. And yeah, let's make it real. We also maybe want to have like a background, right? Comics are a little bit more fun if you have more things than just like a character in front of a black screen. So let's do that. And if you want to actually create multi-layer components, we could, for example, create subcomponents that actually like just handle the state for a certain comic layer, just actually do the configuration, for example, this element with this animation options, and put this into our comic panel component. And the only thing that the comic panel component does is later on synchronizing these animations. So we create these comic panel layers, they do the configuration, and then later on in our comic panel component, we can set up the animation by also using the handy group effect constructor, which is part of the Web Animations API that helps us to group together all these animations so we can just like easily start and stop them together, although they're configured differently. For example, we will see later in the example how this could actually look like. We create an animation object, and then we can pause it, set the animation, and with our action hooks, we can simply say play and pause, also part of the Web Animations API, to start these animations. No run loop or something like this for us required. Out of the box, we get this all from the API. Looks really cool. So just have a quick look how this then looks like. So we have the demo, and then we have this large image that loads, and then if we click play, we can actually see the character in the foreground moving in an infinitive loop, and then in the background, we can also see how this background shifts up and kind of like increases in like opacity a bit, and also like in saturity. So like we can actually apply different kind of like animations to our context and still be in the same scope of our comic panel, right? So we can just play and pause it together, although we have configured it differently. So this is quite exciting in my opinion. What we can see, creator experience-wise, really great. Hard even in the Word. Also developer control, be really great. Accessibility-wise, we have the advantage that we actually animate on DOM objects. So if you, for example, inside of our animation had like elements that should do something interactive, right? We could actually easily via HTML create accessibility advantages here. Performance-wise, we kind of like fall into the trap that if we have large animations with a lot of different DOM elements, it might be heavy on our browser, and we might have to have a look on how to optimize that. So finally, to just sum it up, the story about animations is hopefully something that you now realize is something that goes until today, and specs are still ever evolving. The Web Animations API being an example of something very new to kind of like coming up. And I hope that after this talk, you got some idea how open web standards can help you, and maybe also Ember, if you're interested in looking into that, to create your own animations today. And with that said, I wish you very good luck and best efforts to animate the web how you want it to be animated. And thank you very much.